there's an estimate of about 150 billion that's going to be spent, on drone technology between now and 2030. So I think defence will be the major push from that perspective, and a lot of this sort of 5% GDP requirements that Trump's pushing on NATO, I think a lot of that will go into drones.
Hello, you're watching Proactive. I'm joined by HANetf co-CEO Hector McNeil. We're talking about the Drone UCITS ETF, that's DRON. Hector, very good to speak with you. Drones have gone from novelty to necessity on the battlefield. How's that shift changed the investment case for drone?
Well, I think the like all unfortunate circumstances in war, you often get big technology leaps, and I think we're seeing that with the asymmetric wars in Ukraine and in Iran to date. And I think just the rate of technology and the ability to mass produce these weapons, which are obviously providing very effective ways to fight, versus things like the Tomahawk missile that are, tens of millions of dollars, and you can only make 30 or 40 of them a month, where you can do tens of thousands of drones. It's starting to change the story. I mean, just a measure of that is they reckon that 80% of all the damage inflicted on Russian equipment during the war has been affected by drones, right? Being created by drones. And Ukraine has reportedly increased production by 900% of drones in 2025 alone. And then you've got the use case across, the sort of more commercial and civilian world, things like agriculture, where it's a very mature use case for drones, whether that's crop spraying or reviewing fields or looking for weather issues, all those types of things. But I suppose it's just the fact this technology can be mass produced, it's relatively low cost, and it's highly adaptable. But obviously the major beneficiary of it so far has been obviously the warfare elements to it, which is unfortunate, but a truth nevertheless.
I mean, military spending gets the headlines, but the commercial drone market could be just as big. Where do you see the faster growth, defense or civil?
I'd say probably in the short term, probably defense, just simply because the need is today. You're probably seeing that Ukraine is signing all sorts of agreements with people like Qatar and Saudi Arabia. There's a very interesting company called Swarmer that's recently IPO'd and is a Ukrainian company listed in the US. But equally, there's an estimate of about 150 billion that's going to be spent, on drone technology between now and 2030. So I think defence will be the major push from that perspective, and a lot of this sort of 5% GDP requirements that Trump's pushing on NATO, I think a lot of that will go into drones. And what's really interesting for me is that it's sort of breaking up this sort of common industrial complex. It's not being dominated by the top 5, 6 defence firms. The Lockheeds and Boeings and British Aerospace of the world. It is a lot of SMEs, a lot of startups. And actually, one of the most interesting things for me is, obviously we all remember when Zelensky sat in the White House with Trump, and Trump said, "You don't have any cards," and shouted at him. Well, actually now Ukraine does have some of the cards because it has a lot of the systems and a lot of the information. And a couple of really, really interesting companies in the sector is EHang, which has got autonomous area vehicles, urban mobility, so things like taxis and transport. You're going to see more in that space. You even see these things moving logs and forestry, in places like Canada, etc. Another one's Ondas, which is building autonomous systems, which can be industrial and government use, and automated aerial intelligence. So that's a crossover between civil and defence. And as I said, you're talking about $150 billion market by 2030. Which is pretty amazing, really.
The ETF takes a pure play approach to avoid dilution from big aerospace names. Hector, why does that matter?
Well, I think it matters because the market's going to grow so quickly that you want to have a correlation to that growth. And in reality, when you've got these big aerospace companies, it's only going to be a drop in the ocean for them, in terms of their drone sectors. Well, maybe you might see a bit of M&A in that world, but in terms of you want to really capture the growth, and the power of these companies as they come through and grow, it's really going to be by being in a pure play space and, buying companies like EHAN and Swarmer and Ondas, versus buying the Lockheeds and Boeings of the world, and it happens a lot in thematic ETFs where they have what I call placeholders. placeholder companies, which is you saw it with the blockchain ETFs where companies like Merrill Lynch and Santander were included in indices, but obviously they had zero correlation to blockchain technologies and crypto, but they were there because that was the best they could get. So I think what's really interesting in this world is you can have more of a pure play scenario, and we've worked very hard with a company called Vetify, who's one of the leading index providers in the world. And we work with those guys to make sure that we have a really effective way of bringing in these pure play companies, and there's going to be lots of IPOs in this sector, so making sure that we're fleet of foot. We've actually added a fast track IPO option on this and a couple of our other thematic ETFs. That if there's an IPO, we can bring that company into the index quicker than waiting for a rebalance. So we think it's going to be a really dynamic sector, and that's why you should really think about being in a pure play rather than a generalist scenario.
We definitely want to look at. Hector, thank you very much for your insights.
No problem. Thank you. Always a
That's
pleasure.
Hector McNeil, the co-CEO of HANetf.